I'm Samuel Morrison, 66 years old, and this is the story of how my son-in-law learned that calling a military intelligence linguist just a translator is the kind of mistake that ends with federal espionage charges and a lifetime in prison. Especially when that linguist spent 28 years conducting foreign intelligence analysis, counterintelligence operations, and learning to recognize patterns of deception in 7 different languages across multiple cultures. 5 weeks after we buried my daughter Rachel, my son-in-law Marcus Chin walked into my study carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone who thought he was about to educate a confused elderly relative about how the modern world worked. He was 35 years old, CEO of an international business consulting firm called Global Strategic Advisors, drove a Range Rover, and had the kind of polished confidence that came from convincing people he was more important than he actually was. He sat down in the chair across from my desk without waiting to be invited and started talking to me like I was a child who needed simple concepts explained slowly. Before I tell you how Marcus learned that military intelligence linguists do far more than translate words, and that underestimating someone who spent nearly 3 decades analyzing foreign communications for the Army is catastrophically stupid, I need you to do something. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever had someone reduce your complex career to a simple job description that completely missed what you actually did, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next will show you why language skills combined with intelligence training create capabilities most people can't even imagine. And leave a comment telling me about a time someone underestimated your expertise because they didn't understand what your job actually involved. Your stories matter, and I read every single one. Marcus opened his portfolio and pulled out glossy marketing materials for Global Strategic Advisors. He explained that his firm helped American companies navigate international business opportunities, particularly in Asia and the Middle East. They provided market analysis, cultural consulting, business development support, and facilitated connections with foreign business partners and government officials. The company was growing rapidly, he said, and had recently secured several major contracts with Fortune 500 companies and defense contractors. Marcus said he'd been thinking about my situation and wanted to offer me an opportunity. I was 66 years old, living on a military pension that he assumed was modest. I had language skills that might still have some value despite my age. He was willing to bring me on as a part-time consultant doing translation work for his company. Nothing too demanding, translating business documents, sitting in on occasional meetings to provide interpretation. It would give me something to do in retirement and would supplement my income. He was offering this because Rachel would have wanted him to help her father stay engaged and financially secure. He showed me organizational charts of his company's structure and client lists that included major corporations and government contractors. He explained that Global Strategic Advisors had consultants around the world, many of them former diplomats or business executives with international experience. The company's value proposition was providing clients with insider knowledge about how to do business in complex foreign markets where normal Americans didn't understand the cultural and political nuances. Marcus said my military background doing translation work could be useful for some of their defense contractor clients who needed help with foreign language documents. He understood I'd spent my career in the Army working with languages, probably translating field manuals or interpreting for officers during overseas deployments. That experience might translate reasonably well to business consulting if I was willing to learn some corporate terminology and business concepts. He'd pay me $25 per hour for translation work, which he characterized as generous for someone my age doing entry-level linguistic support. I sat at my desk and said nothing, which Marcus interpreted as grateful confusion rather than the calculated assessment I'd learned during 28 years of intelligence work. He kept talking, becoming more expansive as he described the international business opportunities his company was facilitating. He mentioned ongoing projects in China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, helping American companies understand these markets and make valuable connections. He said the world was becoming more interconnected and companies needed sophisticated guidance to navigate complex international relationships. Then Marcus said something that revealed how completely he'd misunderstood my background and capabilities. He said he knew I'd worked for Army intelligence doing translation and interpretation, which must have been interesting but was fairly straightforward work. Modern international business consulting was much more complex, he explained. It required understanding not just languages, but also business strategy, political dynamics, economic trends, and cultural subtleties that military translators weren't trained in. He wasn't criticizing military service, he emphasized. He was just being realistic about the differences between military translation work and sophisticated civilian consulting. I asked Marcus what languages he spoke. He said he spoke some Mandarin Chinese that he'd learned in business school and picked up during trips to Beijing and Shanghai. Enough to handle basic business conversations, though he used interpreters for complex negotiations. I asked what he knew about my actual language capabilities. Marcus shrugged and said Rachel had mentioned I spoke some foreign languages from my Army career, probably the usual Middle Eastern languages that Army translators learn for deployments. Here's what Marcus didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask about or investigate because he'd been so certain that Army translators were just people who converted words from one language to another without understanding the deeper content. Marcus didn't know that I hadn't been a basic translator or interpreter in the Army. I'd been a foreign area officer and strategic intelligence analyst specializing in signals intelligence and human intelligence analysis across multiple regions and languages. Marcus didn't know that my education included a bachelor's degree in linguistics from Georgetown University, a master's degree in international relations from Johns Hopkins SAS, and that I'd completed the Defense Language Institute's most advanced programs in 7 languages: Russian, Mandarin Chinese, Arabic, Farsi, Korean, German, and Spanish. I'd scored at level 4 proficiency, professionally fluent, in all 7 languages on the Defense Language Proficiency Test. I could speak, read, write, and think in these languages at a level that included understanding cultural context, political nuance, technical terminology, and subtle implications that native speakers use to convey hidden meanings. Marcus didn't know that I hadn't just translated documents. I'd spent 28 years analyzing foreign communications for intelligence purposes. I'd worked at the National Security Agency conducting signals intelligence analysis. I'd served in Defense Intelligence Agency units analyzing human intelligence reports from sources in hostile countries. I'd been stationed in embassies conducting counterintelligence operations. I'd briefed generals and ambassadors and cabinet-level officials about foreign intentions, capabilities, and deception operations. Marcus didn't know that my training included not just language proficiency, but also understanding how intelligence services operated, how espionage worked, how information was compartmentalized and protected, how foreign agents recruited sources, and how to recognize patterns of behavior that indicated someone was engaged in intelligence activities. I'd taken courses at the intelligence community's specialized schools on counterintelligence, technical surveillance, source assessment, and deception analysis. Marcus didn't know that I still held an active top-secret/SCI clearance because I did consulting work for intelligence agencies and defense contractors on language analysis, foreign culture assessment, and counterintelligence training. I hadn't retired and spent my days watching television. I transitioned to consulting work where I made more money than Marcus probably imagined, advising government agencies on foreign intelligence threats and helping companies protect themselves from espionage. Most importantly, Marcus didn't know that everything he'd just described about his business had triggered immediate counterintelligence concerns for someone with my background. Companies that claimed to help American firms do business in places like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea were often fronts for intelligence services or were penetrated by foreign intelligence. The idea that a consulting firm could facilitate business relationships in North Korea, one of the most closed societies on Earth, was absurd unless that firm had relationships with North Korean intelligence services. The claim of helping defense contractors do business internationally raised immediate concerns about technology transfer and espionage. When Marcus finished his pitch about the consulting opportunity he was offering me, he pulled out a consulting agreement for me to sign. The document would make me a contractor for global strategic advisors, give the company rights to any work I produced, and include non-disclosure agreements about company business and clients. He said I should sign it today, so he could start sending me translation projects immediately. The work was easy, the pay was reasonable for someone my age, and it would keep me mentally active in retirement. I looked at that document for a long moment. Then I told Marcus no. I wasn't interested in working for his company. I had serious concerns about whether Global Strategic Advisors was actually doing legitimate international business consulting or was engaged in activities that violated export control laws, compromised national security, or constituted espionage on behalf of foreign governments. Marcus's expression shifted from patronizing patience to irritation. He said I was being paranoid and was seeing conspiracies where none existed. His company was completely legitimate, properly licensed, and did valuable work helping American businesses compete internationally. If I wasn't interested in the opportunity, fine, but I shouldn't make wild accusations about a successful business I didn't understand. He said this was exactly the problem with military people. They saw enemies everywhere and couldn't adapt to the civilian business world where international cooperation was normal and beneficial. Then Marcus said something that made every instinct from 28 years of counterintelligence work start screaming. He said that if I had concerns about his company's activities, I should keep them to myself. Spreading baseless accusations about Global Strategic Advisors could damage the company's reputation and could have legal consequences for me. He had attorneys who protected the firm from defamation and interference with business relationships. If I caused problems, there would be consequences. It was a threat wrapped in business language, but it was definitely a threat. That threat told me everything I needed to know. Legitimate businessmen don't threaten people who decline job offers. They don't warn people to keep quiet about concerns. Marcus's reaction confirmed that there was something very wrong with Global Strategic Advisors and that he was worried about someone with intelligence background looking too closely at what his company actually did. After Marcus left, I sat in my study thinking about Rachel and about how she'd died. The official report said it was a car accident, brake failure on a mountain road causing her to go over a cliff. But Rachel had been an excellent driver and had just had her car serviced the week before. I'd wondered at the time if it had really been an accident. Now I was wondering if Rachel had discovered something about Marcus's business activities and if her death hadn't been accidental at all. I went to the safe in my study and pulled out files I'd been maintaining since Rachel's death. I'd been quietly investigating Marcus because something about him had always bothered me, and Rachel's sudden death had intensified my suspicions. I had copies of Global Strategic Advisors' public filings, news articles about the company, and some preliminary research I'd done on Marcus's background and business relationships. I also pulled out my files from 28 years of intelligence work, my understanding of how foreign intelligence services operated, my knowledge of espionage tradecraft and how to recognize it, my contacts in the intelligence community who could help investigate potential national security threats, my training in conducting counterintelligence investigations. Marcus thought he'd been talking to a simple translator, an old man who'd spent his career converting words from one language to another without understanding deeper meanings. What he'd actually done was describe what sounded like an espionage operation to someone who'd spent nearly 3 decades learning to identify exactly that kind of activity. And then he'd threatened that person to keep quiet, which was possibly the stupidest thing he could have done. I made my first call to Colonel Rhett James Anderson, who'd worked with me at DIA before retiring and joining the FBI's Counterintelligence Division as a senior analyst. I told him I needed to discuss a potential espionage operation being run undercover of an international business consulting firm. James said he'd be very interested in that conversation and asked if this involved Global Strategic Advisors. Apparently, Marcus's company had already attracted attention from counterintelligence professionals. My second call was to Dr. Patricia Wong, who'd been one of my intelligence analysts before leaving government service to work for the CIA's Counterintelligence Center. I told her I had information about what appeared to be a company facilitating technology transfer to hostile foreign governments. Patricia said the agency was tracking several such operations and would want any solid intelligence I could provide. My third call was to Michael Rodriguez, a former Army intelligence colleague who'd retired and become a special agent with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service investigating espionage cases involving defense contractors. I asked if he was familiar with Global Strategic Advisors and whether they'd appeared in any counterintelligence investigations. Michael said the name had come up in several ongoing cases, but they hadn't had enough evidence to move forward with anything formal. Over the next week, I did what I'd spent 28 years learning to do. I gathered intelligence methodically and analyzed it systematically. I started with open-source research using techniques that were perfectly legal, but that most people didn't know how to apply effectively. I examined Global Strategic Advisors' corporate structure, their claimed services, their public statements about international business relationships, and Marcus's background and history. What I found was deeply concerning. Global Strategic Advisors claimed to facilitate business relationships in countries where normal American companies couldn't easily operate, specifically including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. They claimed to have connections with government officials and business leaders in these countries. They advertised services helping American companies navigate complex regulatory environments and establish partnerships. This was either completely fabricated. You can't actually help American companies do business in North Korea because it's illegal, or the company had relationships with foreign intelligence services that enabled access. I analyzed the company's claimed client list and the projects they described in marketing materials. Several defense contractors appeared as clients, with vague descriptions of global strategic advisors helping them understand foreign markets. Several technology companies were listed as clients, with mentions of facilitating international partnerships. Several energy companies appeared, with references to helping them navigate opportunities in sanctioned countries. Then I started applying language analysis and cultural knowledge to examine global strategic advisors' materials more carefully. I found multiple indicators that suggested foreign intelligence involvement. The Chinese language materials on their website contained phrases and terminology that were characteristic of official Chinese government communications, not business consulting. The Russian language content included grammar patterns and vocabulary choices that suggested it had been written by Russian intelligence officers rather than business consultants. The Arabic materials about Middle East consulting used terms and frameworks that appeared in Iranian intelligence doctrine. Marcus had made a fatal mistake when he'd shown me those organizational charts and client lists. He'd thought he was impressing a simple translator with how sophisticated his business was. What he'd actually done was provide intelligence to someone who knew how to analyze organizational structures for indicators of intelligence service penetration and who recognized several names on those lists as known or suspected intelligence officers operating under business cover. I pulled Rachel's personal files that I'd kept after her death. Buried in what looked like routine papers was a folder containing notes she'd made about concerns regarding Marcus's business. Rachel had discovered communications between Marcus and foreign contacts that worried her. She'd found evidence of technology documents being transmitted to foreign entities. She'd documented meetings Marcus had attended that seemed unusual for a business consultant. Rachel had been gathering evidence because she'd suspected Marcus was involved in something illegal, possibly espionage. The folder also contained a letter Rachel had written but never sent, addressed to me. She explained that she discovered Marcus was involved in espionage, facilitating the theft of American technology and passing it to foreign intelligence services. She'd been planning to report him to the FBI, but wanted to gather comprehensive evidence first. She asked that if anything happened to her, I should make sure the information reached the right people. The letter was dated 2 weeks before she died in that car accident. I sat in my study holding Rachel's letter and understanding with cold clarity that Marcus had almost certainly murdered my daughter. She'd discovered his espionage activities and he'd killed her to protect his operation. The brake failure that caused her accident hadn't been mechanical failure. It had been sabotage. Marcus had called me just a translator and had thought he could offer me menial work translating business documents. He'd had no idea he was describing an espionage operation to someone who'd spent 28 years conducting counterintelligence work. He'd threatened me to keep quiet, not understanding that threatening a military intelligence officer with counterintelligence training was the worst possible tactical decision. And he'd murdered my daughter, thinking he'd gotten away with it, not realizing that her father had the skills, the knowledge, the contacts, and the absolute determination to expose everything he'd done and bring him to justice, not just for espionage, but for murder. The investigation was beginning, and Marcus was about to learn that military intelligence linguists don't just translate words. We analyze patterns, recognize deception, conduct investigations, and hunt enemies with capabilities that make civilian criminals look like amateurs playing at tradecraft they don't understand. The morning after Marcus's visit, I woke at 0500 with the same discipline that had governed my schedule throughout 28 years of military intelligence work. I made coffee, completed my morning exercise routine. Physical fitness remains essential regardless of age, and sat down at my secure workstation to begin a systematic counterintelligence investigation of global strategic advisors and Marcus Chen. The first principle of intelligence work is understanding your target completely before taking action. You gather information from multiple sources, you analyze patterns, you identify vulnerabilities, and you build a comprehensive intelligence picture. Only then do you act. Marcus thought I was just an old translator who declined a job offer. He had no idea I was conducting the kind of methodical counterintelligence investigation I'd spent nearly 3 decades learning to execute against sophisticated adversaries. I started by conducting deep background research on Marcus himself using both open-source methods and access I maintained through my continued security clearance and consulting relationships. Marcus Chen had been born in the United States to Chinese immigrant parents. He'd attended UC Berkeley for undergraduate studies in international business, then had gotten an MBA from a mid-tier business school. His early career had been unremarkable, various positions at consulting firms and trading companies, nothing particularly successful or noteworthy. The interesting part was what happened 10 years ago. Marcus had spent 6 months in China ostensibly doing business development work for a trading company. When he returned, he'd suddenly had capital to start Global Strategic Advisors and had immediately begun securing clients and establishing international relationships that should have taken years to develop. Someone had provided Marcus with resources, connections, and support. The most likely explanation was that Chinese intelligence had recruited him during that 6-month period and had set him up in business as an access agent. I analyzed Global Strategic Advisors' corporate structure using tools and techniques I'd learned analyzing front companies for foreign intelligence services. The company had a complex ownership structure involving multiple shell companies and offshore entities. The funding sources were opaque. Several of the board members and advisors had backgrounds that raised counterintelligence red flags. Former government officials who'd left under questionable circumstances. Businesspeople with known or suspected connections to foreign intelligence. Individuals who'd been denied security clearances for unexplained reasons. The company's client list was particularly revealing when analyzed with counterintelligence methodology. Multiple defense contractors who worked on classified projects. Technology companies developing sensitive capabilities. Energy firms with access to critical infrastructure. These weren't random business clients. They were targets that a foreign intelligence service would prioritize for espionage. Global Strategic Advisors was positioned to gain access to exactly the kinds of information and technology that adversary nations most wanted to steal. James Anderson from the FBI Counterintelligence Division called with initial findings from bureau databases. Global Strategic Advisors had appeared in multiple counterintelligence investigations over the past 5 years. They'd been connected to several cases of technology transfer to China. They'd had contact with individuals suspected of being intelligence officers. They'd facilitated meetings between American technology executives and Chinese government officials that had resulted in suspicious technology partnerships. The FBI had been building a case, but hadn't had sufficient evidence to move forward with arrests or seizures. James said the Bureau was particularly interested in Global Strategic Advisors' claimed ability to facilitate business in North Korea. There was no legitimate way for an American consulting firm to have business relationships in North Korea, given the sanctions and the regime's control over all foreign contact. The only way Marcus could be operating there was through relationships with North Korean intelligence services, which meant he was likely facilitating not just espionage, but also sanctions evasion and possibly weapons proliferation. Patricia Wong from CIA Counterintelligence called with information from agency sources. The CIA had been tracking Global Strategic Advisors as a suspected front operation for Chinese intelligence services, specifically the Ministry of State Security. They had intelligence suggesting Marcus had been recruited during his time in China and had been set up as an access agent to penetrate American companies and facilitate technology theft. The agency had identified several instances where technology that American companies discussed with Global Strategic Advisors subsequently appeared in Chinese military or intelligence applications. Patricia said something else that chilled me. The CIA had information suggesting Global Strategic Advisors had been involved in at least 2 suspicious deaths of individuals who'd threatened to expose the operation. One was a former employee who'd gone to the FBI with concerns about the company's activities and had died in an apparent suicide 3 days later. Another was a technology executive who discovered that proprietary information discussed with global strategic advisors had been stolen and had died in a hit-and-run accident before he could report it. Rachel's accident fit the exact same pattern. Michael Rodriguez from CIS provided information about defense contractor connections. Global strategic advisors had been used as a consultant by 8 different defense contractors over the past 5 years. In each case, classified or proprietary information had subsequently been compromised. In several cases, the compromised technology had appeared in Chinese or Russian weapons systems within months of global strategic advisors having access to it. CIS had been investigating but hadn't been able to prove the connection definitively because the espionage was sophisticated and well covered. I spent the next several days conducting the kind of detailed analysis I'd done throughout my intelligence career. I examined travel records showing Marcus and his employees making frequent trips to China, Russia, and other countries of counterintelligence concern. I analyzed communications metadata showing patterns of contact with known or suspected intelligence officers. I reviewed financial records showing money flows that didn't make sense for a legitimate consulting business, but that were consistent with intelligence service funding and payoff structures. I also applied my language skills and cultural knowledge to analyze global strategic advisors' communications and documents in detail. I examined Chinese language materials from the company's website and marketing documents. The Chinese text contained grammatical structures and vocabulary choices that were characteristic of official Ministry of State Security communications rather than business consulting. There were phrases that had specific meanings in Chinese intelligence tradecraft that wouldn't be used by legitimate business consultants. I analyzed Russian language content similarly. The Russian materials showed patterns consistent with SVR, Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, tradecraft. There were contextual cues and terminology choices that suggested the content had been written by Russian intelligence officers or under their direction. The Arabic materials showed similar patterns suggesting Iranian intelligence involvement, specifically MOIS, Ministry of Intelligence and Security. What became clear was that global strategic advisors wasn't just working for one foreign intelligence service. Marcus had built a multinational espionage operation facilitating technology theft and information access for multiple adversary nations. He was essentially operating as a broker, providing American companies as targets to whichever foreign service was willing to pay the most or provide the best access. It was sophisticated, audacious, and represented a massive national security threat. I also conducted detailed analysis of Rachel's death using investigative techniques I'd learned from counterintelligence work. I obtained the police report and the vehicle inspection records from her accident. I had the brake system examined by an independent expert, a former Army vehicle mechanic who'd worked with me on multiple investigations. The expert found evidence that Rachel's brake line had been deliberately severed in a way designed to fail under braking stress, not immediately, but after being used normally for a period of time. It was a sophisticated assassination technique that created the appearance of mechanical failure. The expert's analysis showed that whoever had sabotaged Rachel's brakes had professional training. This wasn't some amateur attempt. It was the work of someone trained in vehicle sabotage, probably by an intelligence service. I obtained security camera footage from near Rachel's home, showing a vehicle matching the description of one registered to a global strategic advisor's employee parked near her car 2 days before the accident. I had the footage analyzed by a facial recognition expert and confirmed that one of Marcus's employees, a man named Dmitry Volkov who claimed to be a business consultant but whose background suggested Russian intelligence training, had been near Rachel's vehicle. I compiled all of this information into a comprehensive counterintelligence case file. I organized it using the methodology I'd learned during 28 years of intelligence work, starting with an executive summary for senior decision makers, followed by detailed analysis sections with supporting evidence, then appendices with raw intelligence and documentation. The case file ran to over 400 pages, including translations of foreign language materials, communications analysis, financial forensics, and counterintelligence assessments. The case file documented that Global Strategic Advisors was a front operation for multiple foreign intelligence services. That Marcus Chun was a recruited agent facilitating espionage against American defense and technology companies. That the company had been involved in the theft of classified information and proprietary technology valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. That Marcus and his operation had been responsible for at least 3 murders, including my daughter Rachel. And that the operation was ongoing and represented a continuing threat to national security. 2 weeks into my investigation, Marcus came to my house again. He said he wanted to check on me and make sure there were no hard feelings about our previous conversation. He brought a bottle of expensive scotch as a peace offering and suggested we have a drink and talk as family. I invited him in, poured drinks, and sat with him in my study while maintaining the appearance of a confused old man who'd simply been overly cautious about the job offer. Marcus started talking about his business again, this time less as a pitch and more as social conversation. He mentioned some of the interesting projects he was working on, helping a defense contractor understand Chinese manufacturing capabilities, facilitating a technology partnership between an American software company and a Russian partner, advising an energy company about opportunities in Iran. He was relaxed and expansive, confident that I'd been sufficiently warned and intimidated to not cause problems. I asked Marcus casual questions about his international work, questions that would seem natural from someone interested in his business, but that were actually intelligence collection probes I'd used hundreds of times during my career. I asked about his Chinese contacts and how he'd developed those relationships. I asked about the logistics of doing business with sanctioned countries. I asked about how he handled the technical aspects of his consulting work when clients were dealing with classified or proprietary information. Marcus answered freely, apparently seeing no threat from an old translator who declined a job offer. He described relationships with Chinese officials who were almost certainly MSS officers. He mentioned Russian contacts who were likely SVR. He talked about facilitating technology discussions where American companies shared technical details that were then somehow understood by foreign partners. He didn't explicitly admit to espionage, but everything he described was consistent with operating as an intelligence access agent. Then I asked Marcus about Rachel. I said I'd been thinking about her death and about the accident investigation. I mentioned that something about it had always bothered me. The timing right when she'd seemed worried about something, the sudden brake failure despite recent service. I asked if Marcus had any thoughts about whether it had really been an accident. Marcus's entire demeanor changed. His expression went from relaxed to carefully controlled. He said very carefully that Rachel's death had been a tragic accident and nothing more. He said I needed to accept that and move on rather than creating conspiracy theories. He said grief could make people see patterns that weren't there, and I should be careful about letting my imagination run wild. It was a warning wrapped in concern, but the message was clear: don't investigate Rachel's death. That reaction confirmed what I'd already concluded from the evidence. Marcus knew Rachel's death hadn't been an accident because he'd ordered it. He was warning me not to dig deeper because he was willing to kill me too if I became a threat. He thought that threat would work on an old man living alone with no protection. What Marcus didn't understand was that 28 years of intelligence work includes training in personal security, counter-surveillance, and defensive measures. Since Rachel's death, I'd been operating under full counterintelligence protocols. My house had security systems that would detect any intrusion or tampering. My car was secured and monitored. I'd established dead man switches, information packages that would automatically be delivered to FBI and CIA if anything happened to me. And I'd alerted my counterintelligence contacts that I was investigating a hostile operation and that any accident or health crisis I suffered should be treated as suspicious. After Marcus left, I immediately documented every word of our conversation. His descriptions of his business activities provided additional evidence of espionage. His reaction to questions about Rachel's death was effectively an admission of involvement. Combined with the physical evidence of sabotage and the pattern of suspicious deaths connected to his operation, I now had a strong case that Marcus had murdered my daughter. I called James Anderson and told him I was ready to provide a comprehensive intelligence package on global strategic advisors, and that the case now included evidence of multiple homicides committed to protect an espionage operation. James said the Bureau was ready to move forward with arrests as soon as they had sufficient evidence to ensure successful prosecution. I told him the evidence package would be complete within 48 hours. I called Patricia Wong and told her the CIA needed to be prepared to support the FBI case with intelligence about Foreign Service connections and with evidence that could be declassified for use in prosecution. Patricia said the agency was ready to coordinate and that they wanted this operation shut down before more technology was stolen. I called Michael Rodriguez and told him CIS needed to be ready to support prosecution with evidence about compromised defense contractors and stolen classified information. Michael said CIS was prepared to move and that they had several defense contractors ready to testify about suspicious contacts with global strategic advisors. Over the next 48 hours, I finalized the comprehensive counterintelligence case package. I included everything: the evidence of Marcus's recruitment by Chinese intelligence, the documentation of technology thefts, the communications analysis showing coordination with multiple foreign intelligence services, the financial forensics showing intelligence service funding, the physical evidence of Rachel's murder, and the pattern of deaths connected to the operation. I also included a detailed analysis of the national security damage caused by Marcus's espionage. Multiple classified programs had been compromised. Technologies that gave the United States military advantages had been transferred to adversary nations. Critical infrastructure vulnerabilities had been exposed to hostile intelligence services. The damage was in the hundreds of millions of dollars direct cost and potentially billions when accounting for loss of technological advantage and compromise of classified programs. The case package also included a personal statement about Rachel, how she discovered Marcus's espionage, how she'd been gathering evidence to report him, and how she'd been murdered to silence her. I included her letter to me that she'd written before her death describing what she'd discovered. I included the expert analysis proving her brake failure had been sabotage. I made clear that this wasn't just an espionage case. It was also multiple homicides committed to protect a foreign intelligence operation. I delivered the complete package simultaneously to the FBI Counterintelligence Division, the CIA Counterintelligence Center, the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, and the Department of Justice National Security Division. I also provided copies to the Congressional Intelligence Committees to ensure oversight and to prevent the case from being buried for diplomatic or political reasons. Marcus had called me just a translator and had thought he could intimidate an old man into keeping quiet about suspicions. He'd murdered my daughter thinking he'd silenced the threat to his operation. He'd continued running his espionage network confident that no one understood enough to expose him. He'd made the fatal error of underestimating a military intelligence linguist with 28 years of experience conducting counterintelligence operations. Someone who didn't just translate words, but who understood the deeper meanings, recognized patterns of deception, analyzed communications for intelligence indicators, and knew how to build cases against sophisticated adversaries. The counterintelligence investigation was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple agencies were coordinated and ready to act. Marcus's espionage operation was about to be dismantled, and he was about to face charges not just for espionage, but for multiple murders, including my daughter's. The old translator he dismissed was about to show him that military intelligence work was about analysis, investigation, and operational execution at levels that civilian criminals couldn't comprehend. The FBI executed coordinated raids on global strategic advisors' offices and Marcus's residence at 0530 on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after I'd delivered the comprehensive intelligence package. Federal counterintelligence operations don't announce themselves. They move with precision timing, overwhelming force, and coordination across multiple agencies to prevent evidence destruction and ensure no targets escape. Over 60 agents from FBI counterintelligence, supported by CIA officers, CIS special agents, and local law enforcement, hit 7 locations simultaneously: Marcus's home, the company's main office, 3 remote office locations, and the residences of 2 key employees identified as foreign intelligence officers operating under business cover. James Anderson called me at 0600 to inform me the operation had been successful. They'd arrested Marcus and 12 of his employees without incident. They'd seized computers, phones, servers, documents, and financial records from all locations. Several of the arrested individuals had immediately requested diplomatic immunity, claiming to be foreign government officials, which actually helped the case by confirming they were intelligence officers rather than legitimate business consultants. James said the evidence seizure had been even more productive than expected. Marcus had kept detailed records of his espionage activities, apparently confident they'd never be discovered. The FBI had also arrested Dmitry Volkov, the employee identified in surveillance footage near Rachel's car before her death. When agents executed the search warrant at Volkov's residence, they'd found tools and materials consistent with vehicle sabotage operations. They'd found communications with Marcus specifically discussing Rachel as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Volkov had requested Russian diplomatic immunity, claiming to be an FSB officer operating under official cover, which made him a Russian intelligence operative on American soil conducting assassinations. The Department of Justice held a press conference that afternoon announcing the arrests. The Attorney General personally presented the case, flanked by the FBI Director and the Director of National Intelligence. They announced the dismantling of a sophisticated espionage ring that had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars worth of American technology and classified information over 5 years. They described Global Strategic Advisors as a front operation for multiple foreign intelligence services that had targeted American defense contractors and technology companies. They announced charges including espionage, conspiracy, theft of trade secrets, violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and multiple counts of murder. The press conference revealed that the espionage ring had been exposed by a comprehensive counterintelligence investigation conducted by a former military intelligence officer whose daughter had been murdered by the operation. The Attorney General thanked the unnamed officer for providing the evidence that broke the case. My name wasn't mentioned publicly, which was how I'd requested it. But within the intelligence community, everyone quickly knew who'd built the case. By the following morning, the story was international news. Major outlets covered it as one of the most significant espionage cases in decades. The Chinese government issued statements denying any connection to Global Strategic Advisors and claiming Marcus was a criminal acting independently. The Russian government similarly denied involvement despite Volkov's claim of FSB affiliation. The Iranian government said nothing. The North Korean government issued a statement claiming the entire case was American fabrication designed to justify aggression against the DPRK. The intelligence community's reaction was different. I received calls from dozens of former colleagues, people I'd worked with at NSA, DIA, CIA, and across the military intelligence branches. They'd read the classified version of my intelligence package and were stunned by both the scope of Marcus's espionage operation and the comprehensive nature of the investigation I'd conducted. Several said it was the most thorough counterintelligence case file they'd seen in their careers. Multiple agencies asked if I'd be willing to consult on other counterintelligence investigations. Within 72 hours of the arrests, additional evidence emerged that expanded the scope of the case dramatically. FBI forensic examination of seized computers revealed that Global Strategic Advisors had facilitated espionage affecting 23 different defense contractors, 11 major technology companies, and 6 energy sector corporations. The stolen information included classified military technology, proprietary manufacturing processes, critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, and personal information about thousands of individuals with security clearances. The forensic teams also found communications showing Marcus had been coordinating with intelligence officers from China's Ministry of State Security, Russia's SVR and FSB, Iran's MOS, and North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau. He'd literally been operating as a broker, selling access to American companies and technology to whichever foreign service was willing to pay the most. The audacity and scope of the operation was breathtaking. Marcus had built a multinational espionage marketplace. Most damning was the evidence related to murders. The FBI found communications showing Marcus had ordered 3 killings to protect his operation. Rachel had been targeted after discovering evidence of espionage and planning to report it. The former employee had been killed after contacting the FBI with concerns about the company. The technology executive had been murdered after discovering stolen proprietary information. All 3 deaths had been made to look like accidents or suicides. All 3 had been carried out by Dmitry Volkov or other intelligence officers on Marcus's payroll. The evidence included detailed planning documents, surveillance reports on the victims before their deaths, and after-action communications confirming the killings had been successfully executed. There were even financial records showing payments to Volkov specifically designated as compensation for special operations, with dates corresponding to the 3 deaths. The murder evidence was so comprehensive that prosecutors said it was the strongest homicide case they'd ever seen in an espionage investigation. 2 weeks after the arrests, the grand jury returned indictments that were unprecedented in their scope and severity. Marcus was charged with 37 counts including espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, theft of trade secrets, violations of export control laws, conspiracy to violate sanctions, wire fraud, money laundering, and 3 counts of first-degree murder. The potential sentence, if convicted on all counts, exceeded life imprisonment plus 300 years. Several charges carried possible death penalty provisions because they involved espionage resulting in deaths of American citizens. 12 of Marcus's employees were indicted on similar charges, though most faced fewer counts than Marcus. 3 were identified as Chinese MSS officers operating under business cover. 2 were Russian SVR officers. 1 was an Iranian MOIS officer. 1 was a North Korean RGB officer. The presence of foreign intelligence officers from multiple hostile nations operating together in a single organization was almost unprecedented. It demonstrated a level of coordination among adversary intelligence services that surprised even experienced counterintelligence professionals. The Chinese, Russian, and Iranian governments all demanded the return of their arrested intelligence officers, claiming diplomatic immunity and threatening consequences if their people weren't released immediately. The State Department rejected all such demands, pointing out that none of the arrested individuals had been operating under official diplomatic cover and that committing espionage and murder on American soil wasn't protected activity regardless of diplomatic status. The international diplomatic situation became extremely tense. Marcus's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the Department of Justice wasn't interested in being generous. The evidence was overwhelming. The damage to national security was massive, and 3 American citizens, including a young woman, had been murdered. The government was prepared to seek the death penalty and was confident of conviction on most, if not all, counts. Marcus's attorney tried to argue that his client had been coerced by foreign intelligence services and was essentially a victim himself. The prosecutors pointed out that financial records showed Marcus had been paid over $15 million for his espionage activities, which didn't suggest coercion. 1 month after the arrests, I was asked to testify before closed sessions of both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees about the investigation and its implications for American counterintelligence. I spent 8 hours over 2 days walking committee members through how Marcus's operation had worked, what intelligence I'd gathered, how the investigation had been conducted, and what the case revealed about foreign intelligence service capabilities and intentions. The senators and representatives asked detailed questions about how a single espionage operation had managed to penetrate so many American companies and steal so much technology without being detected earlier. I explained that Marcus had exploited several systemic vulnerabilities. First, American companies were often naive about counterintelligence threats and eager to pursue international business opportunities without adequate security vetting. Second, the intelligence community had been aware of some concerning indicators, but hadn't had the resources or legal authorities to investigate aggressively until after the damage was done. Third, Marcus had been sophisticated about operational security and had used multiple cover identities and compartmentation to hide the full scope of his activities. Several committee members asked about my role in the investigation and how I'd been able to build such a comprehensive case when government agencies with far more resources had struggled to do so. I explained that my combination of language skills, intelligence training, and personal motivation had been crucial. I'd recognized patterns in Marcus's activities that others might have missed because I had decades of experience analyzing foreign intelligence operations. I'd been able to conduct analysis of foreign language materials at a level that few people in government could match. And I'd been personally invested in exposing Marcus because he'd murdered my daughter. One senator asked me directly whether I thought Rachel's murder could have been prevented if counterintelligence agencies had been more aggressive in investigating global strategic advisors when initial suspicions arose. I told him honestly that yes, I believed Rachel would be alive if the FBI had moved more quickly on the early indicators of espionage. But I also said that counterintelligence work was resource-intensive, that agents were overwhelmed with threats, and that legal constraints often prevented aggressive investigation until more concrete evidence existed. The failure wasn't incompetence. It was a system that was under-resourced and over-constrained relative to the threats it faced. The committee hearings resulted in recommendations for increased counterintelligence resources, streamlined legal authorities for investigating suspected espionage, and better coordination between intelligence agencies and the private sector companies that were being targeted. Several senators said my testimony had been crucial in helping them understand the severity of the threat and the need for congressional action. 3 months after the arrests, the government offered Marcus a final plea opportunity. Plead guilty to multiple espionage charges and 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, accept a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, cooperate fully with ongoing counterintelligence investigations, and provide detailed information about all his contacts with foreign intelligence services. In exchange, the government would drop the death penalty specifications and wouldn't seek the death penalty at trial. The offer was available for 48 hours, after which it would be withdrawn and the government would proceed to trial seeking execution. Marcus's attorney came back 36 hours later accepting the plea deal. Marcus wasn't willing to risk a death penalty trial with the overwhelming evidence against him. He agreed to plead guilty and cooperate. The plea hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I attended the plea hearing along with family members of the former Global Strategic Advisors employee and the technology executive who Marcus had ordered killed. We sat together in the courtroom gallery, 3 families whose loved ones had been murdered to protect an espionage operation. The courtroom was packed with FBI agents, intelligence community personnel, prosecutors, and media representatives. Security was intense because of concerns about potential attempts by foreign intelligence services to silence Marcus before he could provide cooperating testimony. Marcus was brought into the courtroom in shackles, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, looking decades older than his 35 years. Prison and the weight of facing life imprisonment had aged him dramatically. He stood before the federal judge and pleaded guilty to 18 counts of espionage, theft of trade secrets, violations of export control laws, conspiracy to commit murder, and conspiracy to violate sanctions. He admitted that he'd been recruited by Chinese intelligence 10 years ago and had established Global Strategic Advisors as a front operation to facilitate espionage. He admitted that his company had stolen classified information and proprietary technology from American companies. He admitted that he'd worked with multiple foreign intelligence services, including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. He admitted that he'd ordered the murders of 3 people, including Samuel Morrison, because they'd threatened to expose his operation. The hearing was devastating to witness. Marcus stood there admitting in detail how he'd betrayed his country, stolen national defense secrets, and murdered 3 innocent people, including my daughter. The judge asked him repeatedly if he understood what he was admitting and if anyone had coerced him into pleading guilty. Marcus confirmed he understood and that the plea was voluntary. The judge accepted the guilty pleas and scheduled sentencing for 3 months later. After the hearing, several reporters approached me outside the courthouse. They'd figured out I was Rachel's father and the intelligence officer who'd built the case against Marcus. They asked how I felt seeing my son-in-law plead guilty to murdering my daughter. I told them simply that justice was being served and that I hoped Marcus's prosecution would deter others who might consider engaging in espionage or harming Americans to protect foreign intelligence operations. The reporters asked about my background and how I'd been able to investigate such a complex case. I told them I'd spent 28 years in military intelligence and had applied that training to exposing a national security threat. They asked if I felt my military service had prepared me for this situation. I said absolutely. Everything I'd learned about analysis, investigation, and counterintelligence operations had been essential to understanding what Marcus was doing and gathering evidence to stop him. One reporter asked whether I thought there were other operations like Marcus's still operating in the United States. I said definitely yes. Marcus's operation had been sophisticated but not unique. There were certainly other front companies, other recruited agents, other espionage operations targeting American technology and national defense capabilities. I said American companies needed to be more aware of counterintelligence threats. Government agencies needed more resources for investigating espionage, and citizens needed to understand that foreign intelligence services were actively working to steal American secrets and were willing to kill to protect their operations. That evening, James Anderson called to thank me personally for the work I'd done on the investigation. He said the Bureau had been struggling to build a case against Marcus for years and might never have succeeded without the comprehensive intelligence package I provided. He said my combination of language skills, intelligence training, and determination had been exactly what was needed to crack the case. James said he hoped I'd continue consulting on counterintelligence cases because the country needed people with my capabilities. For months after the initial arrests, Marcus was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. He was also ordered to pay restitution of $275 million for the stolen technology and classified information, though everyone understood he'd never pay anything close to that amount. The judge said Marcus had committed some of the most serious crimes possible against the United States. He'd betrayed his country for money. He'd stolen national defense secrets that endangered American military personnel, and he'd murdered 3 people to protect his treasonous activities. The judge said life imprisonment was appropriate, and that Marcus should spend the rest of his life in a maximum security federal prison thinking about the damage he'd caused. Marcus stood there as the judge pronounced sentence, showing no emotion. When asked if he had anything to say, he declined to speak. Marshals led him out of the courtroom to begin serving his life sentence. I watched him leave and thought about Rachel, about how she'd tried to expose his crimes and had paid with her life, and about how her death had ultimately led to his exposure and the dismantling of his entire operation. The old translator Marcus had systematically destroyed his espionage empire and sent him to prison for life. 28 years of military intelligence experience had proven more powerful than all of Marcus's foreign intelligence service training and support. The 2 years following Marcus's sentencing brought systematic dismantling of the espionage networks he'd built and prosecution of dozens of individuals who'd participated in or facilitated his operation. The FBI's investigation, built on the foundation of intelligence I'd provided, expanded to identify over 40 people who'd knowingly assisted Marcus's espionage activities. Some were arrested in the United States. Others were indicted and became international fugitives. Several foreign intelligence officers were declared persona non grata and expelled from the country. The damage assessment conducted by the intelligence community revealed that Marcus's operation had compromised 23 classified defense programs, stolen proprietary technology from 17 companies worth an estimated $350 million, and exposed the identities of dozens of intelligence community personnel and sources. The assessment concluded it was one of the most damaging espionage cases in modern American history. Multiple defense programs had to be redesigned because their specifications had been stolen. Several intelligence operations had to be terminated because they'd been compromised. I used the life insurance money from Rachel's policy, money Marcus had probably planned to access, to establish the Samuel Morrison Counterintelligence Foundation. The foundation provided scholarships for students studying foreign languages and international security, funded research into counterintelligence techniques, and supported programs educating American companies about espionage threats. It also provided support for families of counterintelligence officers and for victims of espionage operations. The foundation's work attracted attention from across the intelligence community. I was invited to teach counterintelligence courses at the Defense Language Institute, where I'd once been a student. I gave presentations at CIA and FBI training programs about recognizing espionage indicators and conducting counterintelligence investigations. I consulted on multiple ongoing cases involving suspected foreign intelligence operations. My age, the thing Marcus had used to dismiss my relevance, became an asset because my decades of experience provided perspective that younger analysts couldn't match. 18 months after Marcus's sentencing, I testified at the trial of Dmitry Volkov, the Russian intelligence officer who'd murdered Rachel. Volkov had refused a plea deal and insisted on trial, apparently believing the evidence against him was circumstantial. I spent 2 days on the witness stand explaining how I'd investigated Rachel's death, traced the sabotage of her vehicle, identified Volkov through surveillance footage, and discovered communications proving he'd been ordered by Marcus to kill her. The prosecutors also presented the vehicle sabotage expert's testimony about how Rachel's brakes had been deliberately severed. They showed the surveillance footage of Volkov near Rachel's car. They presented communications between Marcus and Volkov, specifically discussing eliminating Rachel as a threat. The evidence was overwhelming. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Volkov on all counts, including first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit espionage, and acting as an unregistered foreign agent. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 70 years. After the verdict, I stood outside the courthouse and spoke to assembled media. I said that justice had been served for Rachel and for the 2 other Americans Marcus's operation had murdered. I said I hoped these prosecutions would send a clear message to foreign intelligence services that murdering Americans on American soil would result in severe consequences. I dedicated the verdict to Rachel's memory and to all Americans working in counterintelligence to protect the nation from espionage threats. 3 years after exposing Marcus's operation, I was invited to receive the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal in a classified ceremony at CIA headquarters. The Director of National Intelligence presented the award, which recognized my investigation of global strategic advisors as having prevented continued massive damage to national security and having dismantled one of the most sophisticated espionage operations ever conducted against the United States. The citation specifically mentioned that my work had been conducted as a private citizen using skills developed during military service, representing the highest traditions of intelligence community dedication. The ceremony was attended by dozens of former colleagues from across my 28-year career, people I'd worked with at NSA, DIA, CIA, and military intelligence units around the world. After the ceremony, many of them told me they'd followed the case and had been impressed by the thoroughness of the investigation. Several said it demonstrated that intelligence skills and experience didn't diminish with age, but actually became more valuable through decades of application. I'm Samuel Morrison, 68 years old now. I'm a retired Army intelligence linguist who spent 28 years conducting foreign intelligence analysis and counterintelligence operations in 7 languages across multiple continents. I'm a father who lost his daughter to an espionage operation, but who honored her memory by exposing that operation and ensuring everyone involved faced justice. Marcus Chin called me just a translator and dismissed my military intelligence work as simple language conversion that didn't involve understanding complex international business. He murdered my daughter thinking he'd silenced the threat to his espionage operation. He continued facilitating theft of American technology and classified information, confident that no old translator could threaten his sophisticated multinational intelligence network. He learned that military intelligence linguists don't just translate words. We analyze communications for hidden meanings, recognize patterns of deception across cultures, conduct investigations against sophisticated adversaries, and build comprehensive intelligence cases that expose operations others can't see. He learned that underestimating someone with 28 years of counterintelligence experience is fatal. To anyone whose expertise has been reduced to a simple job title that misses what you actually do, stand your ground. Use your knowledge and experience. Don't let people dismiss capabilities they don't understand. Military intelligence training, language expertise, and counterintelligence skills are permanent assets that actually improve with decades of experience. Marcus's espionage empire fell because he thought translation was about converting words without understanding content. He didn't realize that intelligence linguists are trained to see beyond words to intentions, to recognize deception, to analyze patterns, to build cases. Those capabilities don't expire. They become more refined through experience. This is Samuel Morrison, retired military intelligence officer, signing off. To my fellow intelligence community veterans, your skills matter more than civilians might understand. Language expertise combined with intelligence training creates capabilities that are irreplaceable. Age brings perspective, experience, and judgment that make you more effective, not less. Keep serving, keep contributing, and prove that intelligence work is about understanding, not just information processing. The old translator proved that experience, training, and determination defeat youth, arrogance, and foreign intelligence service support every time.